Hi, Pablo.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on. Let me just introduce us. This is meaningoflife.tv. I am Philip Menchaca, project coordinator at Union Theological Seminary. And joining us is Pablo Sender from California. He's a microbiologist, and most relevant to our conversation today, he is a national speaker for the Theosophical Society. And before coming to California, he had worked in the International Theosophical Society's headquarters in India. And that's in Chennai, India, correct?
It's correct, yeah.
Yeah. And they had some flooding there recently. Any sense of how things are now?
Yes, they are better now. I was there. I left just before the flooding. I was giving some classes there in November. And there was some flooding when I was giving the classes, but then the worst part came in December. I left middle of November.
Okay, well, I hope things have gotten cleaned up there.
Yeah, now they are better there. Yeah.
So, anyway, as our listeners may have guessed, we're going to be talking about Theosophy, what it is, what it means to you, and I'd like to hear a bit later about kind of how you see connections between your scientific background and Theosophy, or how kind of those science and religion or philosophy kind of meld together. But first, I just kind of want to just jump right into the nuts and bolts of philosophy about what it is. If we were at a cocktail party together, just I don't know, chatting over a platter of shrimp or something, how would you explain Theosophy to me?
Yes, that is not a very easy topic to talk about in a party.
Yeah, it's from what I've seen, it's expansive. There's a lot there.
Yeah, I think we could start by defining the word theosophy. It comes from the Greek. Theos means divine. You can translate it also as God or gods, that the Greeks were polytheistic. So theos involves anything that is related to the divine. And then Sophia is wisdom. So the translation we use in the Theosophical Society is the divine wisdom. This term has been used in the past by different movements and religious traditions. It is thought that was created by the Neoplatonists, who were a group of Greek philosophers at the beginning of the Christian era. And later it was used also even in Christianity as the wisdom of God. In the 19th century, when the people who founded the Theosophical Society, that we can talk a little about that later, when they decided to form this organization, they thought that this term defined what they were aspiring to, what they were seeking, which is this divine wisdom. The idea of divine wisdom in the Theosophical Society is not so much a wisdom that is out there in some external God, but the idea is that there is a kind of wisdom in all of us, potentially, which has to be tapped into. And it's a wisdom that is not human in the sense that it's not the mere result of thinking and reasoning and experience. It's a wisdom that is an intrinsic, inherent aspect of our being, our spiritual being. So when we talk about theosophy, it's not quite philosophy as we understand it in the modern term, in the modern way, because normally what a philosopher does is to sit down and try to figure things out by thinking, by testing, by trying to understand reality. It's an outcome of a rational aspect. The idea of theosophy is a knowing that comes from a higher aspect, an aspect that transcends the mind, which we could call it a kind of spiritual intuition. And this is the aspect to which every mystic in history has access to. There is a kind of mystical knowledge which comes not necessarily through the senses or through the rational process, although both of them have some part in the formulation of the knowledge. So basically, what the Theosophical Society tries to do is to learn how to live so that we can stimulate that divine wisdom that is latent in all of us, and so that we can have a good life in the philosophical sense, a wise life.
So, well, there's a lot there. Is this? I mean, are kind of mystical experiences one part of this? Are there techniques that are described in theosophical practice about what those kinds of experiences are like and how one attains them?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there are techniques, there are descriptions. The theosophical approach is quite, let's say, holistic, in the sense that what theosophists have seen, and many other, some other philosophers in the past, is that in order to tap into this divine wisdom, we cannot do it by merely following a simple technique or something that doesn't involve the whole of your life. So what normally, for example, in the Theosophical Society, it is promoted is an approach by which the person engages in the study of different philosophies and religions. Then a life of service in a wide sense, not just merely giving money to some organization or some poor people, but having an attitude of service wherever you are, an attitude that tends to break the self-centeredness. We tend to relate to the world in terms of me and what I can get from the world. But in order to access this wisdom that is transpersonal, is beyond the personal resources, we need to start relating to life in a way that we are comfortable in a transpersonal attitude, so to say.
So is that recognizing kind of the interconnectedness of life, of relationships between people? And
actually, the concept of unity is a fundamental concept in the Theosophical Society. We can talk a little about the society itself, but the fundamental concept is that ultimately speaking, there is one source of everything that we see. There is not only one source of everything in terms of forms, but also one source of everything in terms of consciousness. So we could say that each one of us is one particular experience of the divine. So we are all a fragment of the divine, in a sense, if you want to put it that way. And the mystical experience is realizing that in terms of the divine, we are the whole. And this is what most mystics in all traditions, they feel. They may call it God, or they may call it Brahman or Allah, but they feel there is a state of consciousness in which you feel you are one with everything that is around. Yeah. And that is a state of consciousness that is a theosophical state of consciousness.
Okay, and so one of the goals is to realize your unity with this greater,
right?
Well, I guess the Hindu term would be the Atman, or I mean, it sounds very much like the Hindu conception, I guess, of this unity, and the goal being kind of to merge with that. Now, I know Theosophy was very influenced by Eastern ideas. Is that correct?
Yes, to some extent. I mean, when the Theosophical Society was founded, Blavatsky, who was one of the founders, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, she traveled around the world when she was young, and then she met some yogis that in Tibet that trained her. And what she did with the Theosophical Society was part of what this group of enlightened beings, or yogis, if you want to call them, what they thought that the world needed. when the Theosophical Society was founded in 1875, in the West, we didn't know anything about Eastern traditions, yoga, meditation, or terms like karma or anything like that. And the West was going through a difficult situation because science was gaining more and more attention, and intelligent people who were intellectually curious, and they were trying to understand the world, not simply by means of blind faith, but by means of reason too, they were all turning into materialists and atheists.
Well, there's also, I mean, during this time, wasn't there also a lot of interest in spiritualism in general?
Spiritualism, yeah.
This idea of contact with the dead and that kind of thing, right? Exactly. This was kind of the heyday of that. So you kind of had, you're saying you kind of had this split, and then in between kind of the scientific and then this other interest, and this is kind of the milieu in which Blavatsky began introducing her ideas. Correct.
There was the regular religion, there was the science. They were clashing quite badly. At the time there was no concept of science and spirituality. Now that idea that the two can touch is growing, but at the time they were seen as completely opposite. And basically the only alternative to that view was the spiritualistic movement, which was a kind of religious movement to a certain extent, but they were showing a certain phenomena that could not be explained by the science of the time. So when Blavatsky began to so part of what Blavatsky wanted to do is to present a philosophy that would bring together science and spirituality, and philosophy too. She claimed that the religious truths are not anti-scientific, they can be explained in scientific terms or in a scientific kind of thinking, and they are not really opposed. But who was going to listen to this? She thought that the spiritualistic movement was a good avenue because they were not so dogmatic about religion, and they were in touch with some phenomena that was showing that there was something else than what science was saying. But she claimed that the phenomena, the spiritualistic phenomena existed, but was not really produced by the spirits of the departed. She said there are many more forces in the universe, and most of the phenomena in the seances are produced by other forces, not by the soul of people. So she went to the seances, she reproduced some of the phenomena, and she said, what phenomena do you want to happen? There were tappings in the table typically, or some materializations. And she said, I can do all that by my own power of will. You don't need a dead people, because these are actually forces that exist.
Do that by your own power of will in kind of a mystical sense, not by physically tapping on the table or anything. Because there were around this time a lot of in the spiritual movement, spiritualist movement, there were people who were fraudulent, There was this famous case in, I think, Rochester, where these three girls who got a lot of interest later admitted they were fraudulent. But you mean she was creating these kinds of...
Yes, by psychic means. In India, there is this idea of siddhis, Siddhi, which means psychic power. This is for example, in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, part of the Raja Yoga school of Hinduism. There is this idea of siddhis. These are like extrasensory perception and psychic abilities, which in India they were very familiar with, but here we were not so much. Now there is a little more research into this, although science still is very reluctant. But Blavatsky, by means of these psychic abilities, she could produce a lot of phenomena there that some spiritualists were producing. Of course, as you say, many of them were frauds, because it's not very easy to do these things or to get these forces to do this kind of phenomena. So only a few could really do it, and the others were faking it for the most part.
And was she accused of being a fraud, of being fraudulent in these ways?
Yeah. Yes. It's difficult to accept that these things can be true, because we don't have scientific means to prove that. And she performed phenomena all over the world with intelligent people, with people who were not theosophists. When she moved to India, because she explained, my purpose in performing these phenomena is to show that there is something more than what science is describing. When I was in college and we were studying the history of science, at the end of the 19th century, before all the revolutionary discoveries of early 20th century with relativity and quantum physics and that the atom could be divisible, before all that, scientists were saying that science was about to end because they had almost everything figured out. So everything was being, explained in terms of like a mechanical clock. And so the science of the future was going to be just to deal with a few details. So this was the idea at the time. Science can explain everything without having to introduce any spirituality at all. So Blavatsky said, I can show that I can perform certain phenomena that cannot be explained with current science. She always said, they are not miracles. I do it using laws of nature, but these are laws of nature that are in a realm that the physical science of this time cannot access yet. So she did a lot around the world. There are, tons of witnesses. But of course, there was always this, from scientifically minded people, there was always this, need to say that she was a fraud. So there was a person from the Society of Psychic Research did a report. He said that he didn't find any proof that Blavatsky had performed these phenomena for sure, and he said that she was a fraud. And now the Society of Psychic Research, 100 years later, wrote a report saying that research had been done in a very biased way, that this guy his name is Richard Hudson, he had not gone or interviewed the people who had witnessed Blavatsky's phenomena. So they recanted the original report. But anyway, at some point, Blavatsky saw that doing phenomena was no good, because people were coming to the TS, but they were interested in the circus.
Like the spectacle of it.
Yeah, and Blavatsky said, I'm interested in showing that there is something more so that you can go beyond this, not so that you get stuck in this. So at some point she stopped, for the most part, doing any of these.
And is that when she started the Theosophical Society, around that time when she came to this realization that those methods, her methods of going around and exhibiting these, her abilities, weren't working? Is that around the time when she started the Theosophical Society?
No, it took like almost 10 years for her to realize that this wasn't working, because it did work with several people. When she moved to India in 1979, and there were some people in the British government and scientists that had heard about Blavatsky. She was quite famous because of all these phenomena. And they were curious about understanding the principles of the phenomena. And they invited Blavatsky. They did experiments with witnesses, with different tests. And many people were convinced of the reality of this. And many began to study the philosophy. But they were a relatively small percentage.
Mm-hmm.
So as the years went by, she realized that this was causing more trouble than something good. So it took a while. She dropped the performance of Phenomena. About 84 or so.
Now, there is this idea, if I believe in Theosophy, between you have kind of a common knowledge and then you have the esoteric knowledge. Is that correct? You have...
Well,
go
yeah,
ahead.
part of what Blavatsky said is this divine wisdom, which is this wisdom that any mystic can access in a spiritual state of consciousness, and the different disciplines of yoga in different traditions, or the disciplines of the Christian mystics, all these tend to stimulate this wisdom. And she said this wisdom is universally available. So any person that taps into this wisdom, they get to the same truth. Now, when they speak, they will wrap it in whatever philosophical or religious context they live. So she said there is an ancient wisdom that is with humanity from the very beginning. And the problem is that as time passes, this original wisdom begins to be obscured, whether because the followers cannot really understand what the original creators of schools or religions really perceived, or because of misunderstanding, or because of trying to use the knowledge in a political sense. For whatever reason, the knowledge begins to be obscured in some points. And also when a religion has to teach all these truths to the masses that may not be even educated, they have to be simplified, put in the form of a myth or in the form of certain stories. So then you get to an exoteric aspect of religions, which is the kind of diluted, although still valuable, but the kind of knowledge that anybody can understand. And then there is the esoteric knowledge, which is the deeper aspect of the religion that is normally taught among those who are interested in following a more serious religious life. So, for example, in early Christianity, scholars are discovering that there was like a mystery school associated to Jesus. Some say that is they were calling it the kingdom of heaven, or the Jesus mysteries. And in these mystery schools, they would talk about the deeper aspects of Christianity. But as Christianity spread around the world, they began to persecute this more esoteric interpretation. So Christianity, for the most part, lost the esoteric teachings, but other traditions still have it. She claims that, in Hinduism, the Hinduism that normal people know is the exoteric aspect, but there are some Brahmins, like the priests, that they have a more deeper knowledge that they normally don't convey to people just because people are not interested in it. So part of what Blavatsky wanted to do, she thought that the Western world and the world in general was intellectually developed enough to begin to look at religions in a deeper way. And part of what she did is to try to talk about these truths that were originally esoteric, but that now people could benefit from it. And of course, there are many other truths that remain esoteric for many reasons. But part of what she wanted to do is to disclose part of these teachings that, she and her teachers thought the world was ready and in fact needed to understand religion in a deeper way, because the simple religion of the time was not addressing the new intellectual needs of the world.
So as part of Theosophical practice, studying the exoteric expressions of religion as a way of accessing the esoteric, the kind of hidden knowledge?
Yes, that is part. There are three aims or objects in the Theosophical Society. The first one is to try to form a nucleus of universal brotherhood without any distinction of sex, race, caste, creed, color. So what the society wanted to do, and actually was the first organization in modern times in doing this, was to generate an international body in which people from different religions, different traditions, different social positions could come together and learn together. There is no dogma in the society. I will explain a little more about that. But, in India, when people from different castes couldn't even sit together at the same table, in the TS, they were all together. They were studying and eating together. You see the newspapers of the time. This was an outrageous idea. Some celebrated it. Many, attacked the TS for doing this. Same in South Africa with black and white people. So the first aim is to to generate a space, a nucleus in which people from all different traditions can come and learn together, learn from each other. The second aim is to stimulate the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. So from the very beginning, the Theosophical Society wanted to bring this holistic view in which religion, philosophy, and science can be integrated. So it was, again, the first organization in working in science and spirituality. Actually, one of the main books that Blavatsky wrote, The Secret Doctrine, the subtitle is a synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science. So she wanted to provide a synthetic view of these three approaches. Okay. And the third aim is to investigate the latent powers in humanity and the unexplained laws of nature. So this has to do more with what Blavatsky was trying to do. There is far more than science knows. There are many latent abilities in human beings, and we have to know about this, and we have to know how to deal with this, because this can change humanity. So part of what we do, and with this I finish, part of what we do is to study in a comparative way, to see the commonalities of the different traditions, where they come together, to see where they depart, and try to see why they depart, so that we can bring some harmony between different traditions, and also to try to perceive that deeper truth that is behind.
Okay. So I'm curious about this this connection between science and spirituality, and is it the idea of applying, when you say the science, is the idea of applying kind of a rational examination of these texts and ideas? Is that kind of where the science part of it comes in, or is there more to it than that?
There is a little more. I would say that the rational approach would be more the philosophy aspect of Theosophy. The idea of all the teachings, and something that I particularly found very interesting in Theosophy is that all the teachings that you can read are supported by a rational explanation. You may believe it or you may not, because it's the same with any philosophical system, but there are no these claims, you are a cosmic portal of this, these vague claims that are many times in the New Age, or whatever claim there is in the Theosophical literature. It is in the context of a quite solid philosophy, which again you may accept or not, but there is an explanation. Now the part with science is actually dealing with the scientific aspect of life, in the sense of, for example, Blavatsky, at the time when science thought that the atom was like a little billiard ball, no divisible or anything, Blavatsky said, The atom is divisible. There is energy within the atom. The forces that science was beginning to research, like electricity, magnetism, all this, Blavatsky says those forces are material in a way, in a kind of matter that science doesn't know, and that is what quantum physics has discovered, that any force is carried by some kind of subatomic particle. And Blavatsky explained all these things, explained many things about the cosmos, the formation of the solar system and the Earth and galaxies. So really into the scientific realm. She says there is a kind of occult science. She used the word occult before that word became kind of funky in modern times. Occult means hidden, something that is not evident. And she said, when you develop these psychic abilities and when you can reach these spiritual states of consciousness, you can learn about the nature of the world, the universe. And there have been in history generations of seers that have researched into the universe and in a scientific way, but not by means of physical instruments, by means of inner perceptions. And to prove this, she talked about the science of the time, correcting what in her view were mistakes. She said, for example, that gravity was not a force. And now quantum physics agrees with that. Quantum physics is the only force in nature that they have not been able to find a particle for is gravity. And Einstein, of course, he said gravity is not a force, it's the bending of the space-time continuum. And Blavatsky always said gravity exists, but it's not a force. So in the Theosophical literature, you see a lot about looking at even the physical universe in a different way. And this different way can bring the spiritual aspect too. So it's a quite complex system. If you are interested, if anybody is interested in the scientific aspect of Theosophy, is quite a deep study.
Yeah. So is the idea kind of twofold then, that these kind of seemingly as mystical phenomenon have a material explanation,
exactly,
and also that where science currently is, it's in a place where it can't necessarily yet explain all of
correct,
these kind of spiritual phenomena that is described in the religious literature and mystical literature.
Exactly. What Blavatsky said basically is that for science to be able to research into this, new methods of let's say perception have to be developed. When I was in science, I remember when the physics teacher said that only is scientific something that we can measure with a machine. If you cannot measure it, it doesn't belong to the realm of science. It may belong to the realm of science in the future, but not in the present, because the condition for something to be scientific is that it can be measured and tested. So, for example, even the string theory in quantum physics, they are debating, is this a scientific theory or a philosophical theory?
Right, because it's not really testable.
Yeah. Exactly. Same with David Bohm's, David Bohm was one of the fathers of quantum physics. He explains quantum physics in a different way than the traditional Copenhagen explanation. And he says that there are some hidden variables hidden that we cannot measure, that if you take them into account, they explain all the phenomena of quantum physics in a far more rational way than this crazy way that they are trying to interpret it. But very few people accept Bohm's view because you cannot measure these hidden variables. So this is an intrinsic problem in science. And that's what Blavatsky was saying. Science has to develop to keep the scientific method, but as more and more scientists become able to perceive with the inner senses in a way that they can test it and they can compare with each other the results, then we will have a science that goes even beyond the physical plane. But until that happens, we have a materialistic science.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, maybe this is actually a good time to, now we've kind of a base of what some of these ideas are. And, as we said at the outset, I think that there's this very large body of theosophical literature, and it's complex. So I feel like we're just touching on the tip of the iceberg here. But maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about, how you first encountered Theosophy and why it makes sense to you. And kind of what meaning you draw from it. I think some people may be a little bit skeptical of some of these ideas, psychic phenomenon, that kind of thing. So I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective on why Theosophy is meaningful to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, since I was a child, I guess I always had the feeling that there should be more to life. Life, as it was lived to me, it always felt kind of empty. So, since I was in my primary school, I started trying to read things maybe about Egypt and how the pyramids were built and Atlantis and all the mysteries, of humanity. And then as I grew up, I started looking into like the New Age literature, and something there always appealed to me. But at the same time, I always felt that it was kind of superficial. They were statements. Some of them didn't really seem to agree with common sense. Some of them were very, very little explored. They were just statements that you had to take. I started also with Western philosophy, and I found it interesting. But again, I found it too intellectual, and somehow I didn't feel that it was going deep enough. So when I was in my 20s, I wanted to explore the question of meditation. And talking to my mom about this, she was going to yoga, and her yoga teacher was a member of the society. So talking to my mom one time, she said, "Oh, I know about an organization." I think she had gone for a lecture once, that they study all these kind of things. So she took me there, and they were giving a class on meditation. So I stayed, and as soon as I started reading a little about Theosophy, I recognized that was what I was looking for. I found, solid explanations, a very deep worldview, an interest that transcended just the personal attainment, because the New Age tends to be very self-centered, and how you can manipulate the world so that you have more and this. And so I found in the Theosophical approach a more transcendental view. And the more I delved into it, the more I identified with it. So at the beginning, what appealed to me the most was the intellectual aspect of Theosophy. I was going to college. I started studying science because I wanted to know how life worked. And I would stay, until 2 a.m. studying my books, because I really enjoyed understanding how things worked. Mm-hmm. But then when I studied with the Theosophical literature that goes so far, so much further than the physical explanation of things, even science began to be boring to me. So I eventually finished college. I went into research, but at some point I realized that I didn't want to spend all my time and energy in a view that at that time already I felt was very constrictive. So eventually I left science to work for the Theosophical Society. I thought that the literature and the practice of Theosophy have changed my life, and I wanted to do something to help those who this philosophy also can help them. So I left science, and I'm a teacher working for the Theosophical Society. And I've been here for 20 years, and still I see that there is so much to explore and keep growing. I never felt this sense of, okay, this is the limit. Beyond that, there is nothing else.
So you weren't totally satisfied with the scientific paradigm, scientific approach to understanding the world of experimental kind of paradigm, and Theosophy was another way of looking at phenomenon in the world.
Yes, if you are a scientist that really questions science, you cannot be satisfied with science. And this is something that you see in college. At the beginning, when the teachers give you a theory, it sounds outrageous. And, I remember all of us as students saying, that is not possible. There is no way that this happens in this way or because of this. And the teacher will tell you, well, this is proved and blah, blah, blah. And a few years later, you begin to repeat what the teachers say. But if you don't let go of that doubt and you keep thinking about it, you can see that it's impossible that things are how science says at a certain level. For example, the idea that in a cell, you have all this amazingly complex metabolism, which, to copy one gene, you need tons, hundreds of proteins that are coming together at the right moment in a perfect sequence. One does this, waits, and then the other does that. And all that is supposed to happen by random bouncing off of the proteins around the cell and just falling at the right time in the right spot. And it is crazy to think that is possible. It's not statistically, it is not possible to explain a cell working unless there is some intelligence behind that is putting some order in this. Now, I argued this with my in the class on genetics. I argued this with my teacher when I was giving my final examination. I used the equations that they give us to explain, for example, evolution of populations, and I show him, if you say that these events are random, there is no possibility, statistically speaking, that evolution can go on. And he says, that is true, but then what do you propose? And I said, well, it is obvious that there has to be some force behind that is bringing some order. And he said, well, that is just philosophy. If you want it to be scientific, you have to develop a way to measure this force. And he was right. The realm of science is limited to whatever can be measured, what I said at the beginning. So this is the typical approach in science. And at some point, I realized that science is very limited. I mean, it's been very successful in producing technological results, but not in
explaining how we've come to be and how our universe works, and certain physical laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then if you go a little further and see, science to me is like a description of how the world works, but it's a description that covers only like the first link in a chain. And I wasn't satisfied with that first explanation. I mean, I love that explanation, but I needed more. So that's what I see, that philosophy and theosophy can bring some explanations that science is missing. Of course, they are not scientific. If I tell you, like Plato, and there is this universal mind, not a mind like in a human being, but universal mind in the sense of a certain force that sets or puts order behind things. That is, of course, not a scientific view. It's a philosophical view. But I agree with that view more than the scientific explanation that all this is random, because randomness is, to me, for sure, not the explanation. The problem is that since science cannot measure what force is there, they call it randomness. Same with the quantum physics. From a theosophical point of view, there are explanations as to how the quantum events happen, but science says that quantum events are random just because they cannot measure what is behind. And this is part of what David Bohm also was saying.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I gather what you're saying here is there's a scientific way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in your case, there's a theosophical way of looking at the world, which is not, does not follow the same paradigm, the same structure, the same experimental proof.
Or that enlarges. I would say it's not opposed to science. The theosophical view is, yes, all that happens in that way, but there is far more behind also. Science closes the door. For example, a typical joke in the scientific world is that a scientist would tell you that there is not another side to the mountain because he cannot see the other side. So you say there is another side to that mountain, and the scientist would say, "What do you mean? Do you see the other side? Can you measure the other side? Therefore, there is no other side to the mountain." Like the idea of life after death. Science says there is nothing after death. Well, how do you know? The idea or the fact that you cannot measure if something is going on in consciousness when a person died doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means it's beyond your reach of measurement. So I go with science up to where science goes, but I refuse to stop there. That's my personal feeling about science.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to me that if so, I mean, I guess it's just kind of a different kind of mindset, because if you can't see it, if you can't measure it, I mean, it's kind of hard to conceive how else do you access it? How else do you understand it? I guess this is kind of like the mystical side of things, because if you can't see it, you can't measure it, you can't perceive it. In what sense can you say that it exists?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is very much how we, the point in development that we are as a culture, and how we are raised. Because, for example, with the Greeks, they would say there are 3 avenues of knowledge: the senses, which imply all this that we are talking about, the ability to see, to test it, to measure it. So the senses, the intellect, they would say, if something makes sense or doesn't make sense, that is also a way to determine reality. Neither of them are infallible. The senses are not infallible. Science is constantly wrong and correcting itself. And the rational explanation also is not infallible, but it's a means of knowledge. And then they would say there is another means of knowledge that is more spiritual, what they would call nous. It's a more intuitive knowledge. If you think of Einstein, he didn't get to his truths by testing, experimenting. He gets to those truths by rational means and by intuitive means. When he explains how he conceived of things, he says it wasn't just a chain of reasoning. At some point there was a breakthrough, there was an insight that showed me how things are. So Einstein got to the scientific truths by non-scientific methods. Now then science was able to prove many of the things that he saw. So for the Greeks, they recognized these 3 levels of knowledge, and for the Greeks the senses was the lowest of them all. For them, the rational and the intuitive was more compelling. Now, of course, all of them are fallible. My approach is any explanation is just that, it's an explanation. For example, there is nothing after death. That is an explanation for which there is no proof. Or there is something after death. That is an equally valid explanation for which there is no proof. So which of the 2 are you going to embrace? If both of them are equally a belief, because science saying there is nothing there is not that they prove it. It's just that they cannot go there. So which of the two are you going to embrace? I personally embrace the one that gives me a more rational view of life. There are many things that can be explained if you bring into the view the idea of reincarnation, for example. We don't know if reincarnation exists. We don't know that it exists. We don't know that it doesn't exist. But how do you explain the world without reincarnation? How do you explain it with reincarnation? Without reincarnation, there is a lot of chaos that cannot be explained to me. With the concept of reincarnation, there is a lot of explanations that make sense of the world. So I take it as a hypothesis. Okay, my view, knowing that is not proven, as no other view is really proven, my view is that reincarnation makes sense. I'm open. In the TS, there is this open mind, the freedom of thought. I'm open to discover something different. But when you have to choose a worldview, I choose the one that is more rationally sound to explain reality around.
Well, this is all very interesting. I think we're getting close to an hour here, so I think we should wrap up.
Just let me say that we focus more on the scientific and philosophical aspect. There is also the religious aspect in Theosophy. Religious just in the sense of spiritual. There are no priests or rituals in Theosophy. But along with this philosophical and scientific interest, there is also a very strong interest of learning how to develop goodness in human beings, how to develop harmony and love and wisdom and peace. So, all these three aspects, the spiritual or religious, the scientific, the philosophical, they all are the foundations of the Theosophical view. Some people may lean more towards one or the other, but the three of them are part of what the Theosophical worldview tries to provide. And meditation and all that is part of the spiritual part.
Okay, that actually kind of gets to how I kind of wanted to wrap this up, I guess, which was, well, maybe it does. I'll see what you think. If there's a kind of what do you think would be like the most important teaching that Theosophy might have for the world? You got me thinking about this when you were talking about this more kind of religious side of teaching people to be compassionate and that kind of thing. So, I mean, is there one kind of teaching that you think is most important?
Yeah, certainly. Traditionally, and I agree, it's been this teaching of unity. The idea that at the deepest levels, we are all one, that we are identified with this particular fragment of reality that we call Pablo or Philip. But the more we grow spiritually, the more those boundaries expand. At the beginning, only psychologically, in the sense that we begin to be concerned not only for my person, but also perhaps for my family, the welfare of my community, the welfare of my country, eventually the welfare of humanity. So there is an expansion at the psychological level of what is important in the world, not only me, but the whole world. But also on a spiritual level, there is a possibility of beginning to perceive that we are far more and beyond this particular personality, that there is something that, an aspect of ourselves that is beyond our thoughts, memories, our emotions. And as we begin to tap into this aspect, the sense of being one begins to be an important part of your life. So if we can stimulate, this is a process, and in the Theosophical view, it may take even several lifetimes to accomplish. But every step that we take towards unity reduces conflict, reduces separation, and is the fundamental factor to bring peace and harmony to the world. So walking in the direction of unity, I think, is the main teaching in Theosophy.
Okay, great. Well, listen, thanks so much for joining. This was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Yeah. So, thanks for coming on, and maybe we can talk again sometime.
Sure, anytime. And thank you for having me. This was very interesting, and I'll follow you and all the videos on your website.
Great, thanks.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.